Hi, Sydney, are you there?
Hi, Murray. Yes, I'm here.
Okay. If you want me to help you with any of the stuff I need, you need to make me a co-host.
Okay, I'll do that now.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the C2C, the Cradle-to-Career informational hiring event. My name is Sydney Armendariz, and I am your MC for today. I'll be helping facilitate today's informational webinar and walking you through what we're doing today. So before we get started, let me get my slides together there. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everyone is on. I see people are still joining, but in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started. So for today's agenda, we'll start with some team introductions, and then we'll go into an overview of Cradle-to-Career's work. And then we'll talk about the current vacancies we have in our office and our approach to both equity and also how we do our work. And then Lila De La Sota from the Department of Human Resources will go through kind of the application process, and then we'll end with a question and answer session where you all can submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function. And of course, if at any time you have questions that come up, please feel free to use that Q&A function on Zoom. Even as we're talking, you don't have to wait until the end of the presentations to ask your questions, but we will hold our answers until the end. But feel free to use that Q&A function as we go through today's meeting. So again, I'll reintroduce myself for folks who are still joining. My name is Sydney Armendariz. I'm the Cradle-to-Career Board Liaison. In state speak, my classification is a Staff Services Manager 3, which may or may not mean anything to you, but my primary role is managing our 3 boards, our governing board, and our 2 advisory boards on data and tools and community engagement. So with that being said, I will turn it over to our Executive Director, Marianne Bates, to introduce the team at large. So Marianne.
Thanks so much, Sydney. And many thanks to all of you who are taking the time to learn more about our work today and the positions that we have open. We're here to answer your questions and to try to help you understand what our work is and what our team is like, and give you an opportunity to learn more about this work before you apply. So as Sydney mentioned, I'm the executive director for the Office of Cradle-to-Career Data. The office was officially started last summer, and then I joined after the governing board was seated in the fall and selected me for this position. I joined this past February, so I've been in this role for about 3 months, and we're just getting started and building our work. So maybe by way of introduction, I come to this work in California, having had a long background in working with large administrative data sets and in evidence-based policy across a variety of contexts. For a long time, I worked at the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, where we launched our work focused here in the US and working with state and local governments very closely on impact evaluations and using large administrative data sets to really shed light on how to improve access to opportunity and equity. So that was my work at JPAL. And then most recently came from the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, where I was also working on evidence-based policy work. So that's my background. I come to this work with a real passion for removing barriers to opportunity and a focus on education and lots of social services more broadly. So that's where I'm coming from. The team right now is small, so we're posting these early director level positions and what's called an HEBA position that we'll talk more about in a moment. This is really an opportunity to join us in building this work. So who's on the team so far? In addition to myself, you've just met Sydney, who's heading up a lot of our really important strategic work, really as relates to our 3 boards and more broadly engaging with communities as well. We have a general counsel on board who provides all our legal guidance. We have a data architect on board. We have an administration chief and an office technician. So if you want to know who's on the team, it's the 6 of us right now, and we're growing and looking to expand. Thank you, Sydney. So what are we doing? What's our vision? So our vision is to foster evidence-based decision-making to help Californians build more equitable futures and empower individuals to reach their full potential. So very big picture, this is about bringing existing information together that already exists at different entities within the state, bringing it together so it can inform decision-making with a real focus on equity and advancing equity and really empowering students and families and learners to reach their full potential. So that's our vision. Next slide. Our work is in 3 main areas. So in green at the top, you can see we're bringing together data on education and job outcomes. Think about this as the analytical data system that we're building. It's essentially a data warehouse that's going to bring together existing information across California's K-12 data, the different higher education segments like the community colleges, the University of California, the Cal States, and also health and human services data and employment data. So where we at with this, we right now have an open solicitation and procuring the technology for the data warehouse, which we can share more about in a moment. We've just finalized legal agreements across 16 different entities to be able to do this work and had a press release recently that detailed all of this. So one is building the analytical data system, what you see in green at the top. The second is in orange here is about what we're calling operational tools. So tools to support college planning and transition. So the idea is to, in tandem with building this data system, also create tools and scale existing services that make it easier for students to navigate the college planning and application process. So one important component of this is supporting the scale up of the California College Guidance Initiative, or californiacolleges.edu, their services, which make it easier for students in California to apply to college and to plan for their financial aid applications and other components of that in a more streamlined way. And then the third and really important aspect of our work is really deep engagement with communities. So engaging with communities early and often about our work. We've just recently seated 2 advisory boards, a data and tools advisory board with 16 people on that, and a community engagement advisory board with an additional 16 people on that advisory board. And as you think about our work, one really important part of it is that it came from an 18-month planning process that had over 100 public working meetings where many dozens, over 200 different individuals engaged really deeply in mapping out the plans for what this data system should be, what it should look like, and how it can really meet the needs of California's families. And we're going to continue that. So as we talk about our work and how we have our board meetings and other meetings, really engaging a lot with communities and being very transparent and open about the work we're doing is a really important part of that. Next slide. So who's the C2C data system for? So for students and families, the idea is to create resources that help them explore key information that help them plan for, apply to, and pay for college, streamline the college and financial aid application process, and monitor the status of college and financial aid applications. And I'll also add to this that we're also ensuring in the future, as we build out our work in phases over the years, that this will expand to include early education, expand to include adult learners and resources for people who are within the high school, college application pipeline stage. For educators, it can streamline college and financial aid application review. They can monitor students' college planning and application progress to support targeted interventions and develop action plans based on data about learning, support services, and employment. So this is largely about those operational tools like californiacolleges.edu that I described, and then also thinking about the dashboards and query builders that we will build onto our analytical data system that allows educators to really dig into the data and in an aggregated way and understand it. And then for advocates and researchers, it'll provide the opportunity to analyze the data collected from different sources to really shape policy and advance educational equity. So if you're looking at the job descriptions that we put out, right, this includes the dashboards and the query builder tools for the analytical data system, and also a research request process where researchers can follow a process that we will build to request access to data so that they can conduct their own independent research on the data that we're bringing together. Okay. So why is this data system being built? One aspect of this work that I am incredibly honored to come into this work at this stage is that many advocates, researchers, policymakers and others have really been advocating for a data system such as this for quite a long time. Because right now our information on these different aspects of the cradle-to-career pipeline, if you will, is separated and disconnected. And that makes it hard to share information that supports planning and transitions for students. And it's hard to explore outcomes for Californians, from early childhood through adulthood, and the factors that shape those outcomes all in one place. So that's the problem that this data system is trying to solve. And we're trying to do it in such a way that actionable information is really in the hands of communities and families. So that connects back to what I was mentioning on how we're really doing this work with lots of public meetings and community engagement and trying to get a lot of early input from the users who would be using these systems. Okay, next slide. And now I'll turn it back over to Sydney.
Great, thank you. So I will share just some information about the governing board and our advisory boards. So our boards include representatives from different data providers, policymakers, and the community. It also balances expertise in K-12 education, post-secondary education, social services, workforce, and government and public perspectives. So we have folks from the UC system, from the California State University system, Health and Human Services Agency. We have tons of different stakeholders. And we tried to make sure that we got pretty much everyone who would be touching the system, who would be accessing the system. So we have a fairly large board. It's 21 governing board members. And then we have the Community Engagement Advisory Board, which has 16 members. And then our Data and Tools Advisory Board has 16 members as well. So as you can see, we have a ton of people involved in this work through our boards. And then not only do we have our 3 boards, but we also are planning to do more stakeholder engagement just with advocacy groups, nonprofit groups, and other folks who are interested in the educational sector and in this work as well. So definitely, are focused on staffing up our boards and making sure that they have what they need to make decisions about the system, but in no means are our board members the only stakeholders that we'll communicate with. We definitely want to engage everyone from community organizations to families and students just as people and not even affiliated with an organization. So those are our 3 boards, and they do meet quarterly. Right now, our governing board meets quarterly, and then our 2 advisory boards, they'll get started with their first meetings this fall. We just staffed those during our May board meeting. So that work is still yet to come, but excited to have all of these wonderful board members on board with us. And so now I'll give it back to Marianne. We're doing a bit of mic passing here. I'll give it back to Marianne to talk about the job opportunities that we have available here in our office. So, Marianne.
Thanks, Sydney. So I'm not going to go through all of the job descriptions. You have access to those on our website if you just look at the careers button, and you can go through all of this in detail. But I thought I would just describe how we're thinking about these 3 different director positions working with each other. So the first one we'll talk about is Director of Data Programs. So imagine this role is essentially bringing the data system to life and making it useful and accessible for families, researchers, advocates, educators, communities. So this includes really envisioning and building these data visualizations and dashboards and query builders that draw from the data system and illuminate it and make it useful. So you can think of this a little bit like data journalism. The idea is that this position will really be in charge of, building a team and working with contractors who can help us figure out how to create dashboards and data visualizations and these processes that really illuminate insights and inform decision-making. It'll also be responsible for figuring out and defining a process for that researcher request process that I mentioned. So if I'm a university researcher and I'd like to request access to these data sets, here's the process through which I can do so. And then we facilitate that process with our data providers. Designing a research library so we can really highlight, here's important studies that came from the data that was brought together. And then another important component of this work that's a bit different is working to scale up these operational tools, eTranscript and California Colleges.edu, and working closely with our partner organizations who lead that work. So that's the Director of Data Programs position. And then the Director of Engagement, think of this as primarily a communications role. So we're really at the early stages. We need to create our brand identity, create a new logo, think about what our website presence should be, launch our social media presence. This has all just been started in a very small way, and we'd like someone to come in who can really think about how we're communicating our work and really listening to our many stakeholders and ensuring that there's that 2-way street of communication. So it's not just blasting things out, it's also really listening to the communities and what they need from our work. And then it's also, writing press releases and creating copy for the website, creating copy for lots of our events, materials, and thinking very strategically about that. So that's the Director of Engagement. And then the next position we'll talk about is the Director of Data Infrastructure. And I'll actually, in a moment, perhaps once I'm done talking, I'll drop a link into the chat that has a link to our open solicitation right now. That RFP is long and detailed. If you want to know more about how we're envisioning the actual data infrastructure of this data system, that's the best place to go. So you can look at the materials for open solicitation. And the responsibility of the Director of Data Infrastructure will be to build the data system that will power those public-facing tools we just talked about, with, of course, a keen eye towards data security, data quality, and ensuring that we're bringing the data together in a way that is useful for learning and illuminating all the information that we want to make available to decision makers. So more details to come, and I'll drop a link to the solicitation in the chat in a little bit. Okay, and the 4th position we have open right now is a little bit more of an earlier career position. The classification is Associate Governmental Program Analyst. And if you really love building systems and working on contracting and procurement kinds of questions, this would be a great position where you have an opportunity to work within a small team and building something new and navigating, the complex and detailed procurement and contract policies that the state of California has. So it's a great opportunity to gain experience in that and be a part of something that's really mission oriented and a part of a new small team. So that's our procurement and contract analyst. Okay, now this is, I really want to highlight this point. We have, 4 positions open right now, and I've gotten a lot of interest in them, which is great. We're going to post more jobs soon. So the planning process mapped out a total of 16 positions for our office. That may also expand over time. We're also going to leverage working with contracted teams. So each of these director positions will then have the opportunity to hire and build a couple of direct reports, and then also work with contractors to implement this work effectively. So please, we encourage you to apply to the jobs we have open right now, and please also sign up for our e-newsletter on our website, so that you can get alerts as we open up new jobs in the future, and really encourage you to stay in touch, because we're going to be doing more hiring over the rest of this year and also in future years as well. All right, so a couple of words on our approach overall, from some of the questions that we anticipate might be coming in. So one thing that I wanted to highlight is our approach to equity, and what does that mean and how are we defining that? So as you can see from the vision statement, equity is really at the core of what we do. And if you look at the legislation that established our office and established this work, it was very clear that the data system should be used to foster evidence-based decision-making to help the state build a more equitable future, and that we should do this work so we can address disparities and opportunities and outcomes. So that was a very clear and important motivation for the legislation that established us. It's central to the work we're doing and the tools we're building. We want to build a system that helps illuminate where there are disparities so that decision makers can take action to address those. So we, wanted to highlight this. This is definitely, a key part of why I was really excited to take on this role and my motivation, throughout my career overall. And just wanted to mention very specifically that we welcome applications from people who have lived experience or professional experience relevant to this vision of helping Californians build more equitable futures. Okay. Switching gears slightly, another question we're getting right now is like, what does remote friendly mean? And we've, different organizations are defining that as everything from like, yeah, you can work Fridays remotely to like 100% remote. So just wanted to address that a bit. So we do have an office at 400 R Street. That's where I am right now. It's available for staff who want to work from the office, but many and probably most positions in our office will have the option to be fully remote. So a couple of thoughts on that. As Lila will explain in a moment, to work remotely for the state of California, you need to be a California resident or move here and become one before you start your job, to be able to work remotely. So you can live anywhere in California. For some of the positions, though, there are going to be a lot of meetings here in Sacramento. So there are hearings. There's a need, to do the job effectively, to sometimes meet with people in person. So you'll need to be in Sacramento when it's useful and strategic, right? So for example, short notice meetings with key stakeholders at the Capitol, or for important strategy and team building meetings. But we're not setting up for most positions something where we say, come into the office X days per week or always be here on these certain days. It's more about using our space for meetings, for coming together as a team when needed. But we're really keeping this kind of a remote first, remote centric office. One caveat, our operations team needs to be in person for some operational work. So that's relevant for the AGPA position. Okay, back to Sydney.
Thank you, Marianne. So now we will have Lila De La Sota from the Department of Human Resources, also known as CalHR, to give a presentation on how to apply for these jobs. I'm sure you have all heard that the state's hiring process is confusing, it's time consuming, all those things. So Lila is here to hopefully make your life a whole lot easier if you're interested in applying for these positions. So Lila, please take it away.
Thank you, Sydney. Hopefully I can stand up to that great intro. So I'm going to go over quickly the roles that C2C has right now and some tips for applying. But really, to Marianne's point earlier, C2C is going to be growing. And so what I want to do is give you some information that can be used across the board, information that will help you with any sort of role that you're wanting to apply for. So the director roles are what are called career executive assignment positions, or CEAs. So these are high-level managerial positions. They have a heavy policy implementation piece to their overall role. They have continuous direct interface with the department directors. This is our top management team. So those director roles that Marianne spoke about, that's what we allocate these to, is this CEA category. You do not need to be a state of California employee or a member of civil service to apply. What we will do is we will take a look at your application package. We use what's called a statement of qualifications to evaluate you to determine if you're qualified. So let's talk a little bit more about that complete application package and what that would look like. You can go ahead. Perfect. So a complete application package consists of 3 parts. There is the employment application, or the standard 678 form, your resume, and your statement of qualifications. What I've included here is a snip from the job postings. So you'll see there's a 1, 2, 3 at top on the slide, and there's 3 bullet points below. So we'll go through each of those individually, but I do want to point out that this section is on all job postings that you apply for. So whether you apply for these roles now or you're looking to apply to future C2C roles, please pay careful attention to this required application package document section. So the first item is your employment application, your standard 678. When you're applying electronically, this just goes through your Cal-Career account. It's very, very easy. It takes you through step by step where you're going to put your information in. This is information about your education, your past experience, your previous employers, dates of employment, things like that. So when you apply through your Cal-Career account, it's going to really take you step by step through that process. You don't have to apply through a Cal-Career account if you don't want to, but then in that case, you will be needing to print out or download the standard 678 form and fill it out. So highly encourage the Cal-Career account whenever you can use that. A resume is required and must be included in your application package. Pretty straightforward. If there's any questions about resumes, please go ahead and throw them in the Q&A. The last thing I want to touch on here is the statement of qualifications. So in this required application package document section, it gives you the instructions for the SOQ, the statement of qualifications. I don't want to take too much time reading these instructions, but I do want to encourage you to please read them carefully. It is critically important. There are 2 pieces that I'm going to point out, and of course it's the 2 pieces that are bolded. So the first is that it is required as part of the examination process. So like we talked about before, career executive assignments are a little bit different from the typical civil service role. We use this statement of qualifications to assess your education, experience, training, any sort of information you're able to provide us as to how you are eligible and capable of the position. So there's information here on what to include, how to structure your SOQ, but it is a required document. A very common error that occurs is folks will submit a cover letter or a prior statement of qualifications from another job. Unfortunately, we would have to disqualify those applications. So it's really, really important to carefully read these instructions and submit the SOQ as requested. The second piece here that I want to draw your attention to is the bold at the bottom. It says the SOQ must specifically address each of the desirable qualifications listed in this posting below. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide where I have a snip of lower down on the job posting. There's a section that says desirable qualifications. So in this area, we have listed in bullet format the items that we're looking for to fill this role. So you want to make sure your statement of qualifications is a narrative discussion of how your education, your experience, your training meets these desirable qualifications. Please be thorough, please be specific. I know some of it's in your resume already. It's in your 678 that you're going to fill out. We have to have it here. It's important to be specific and thorough in the SOQ to address how you meet these desirable qualifications. This is part of our initial review, and like we stated on the previous slide, it is required to be considered. Go ahead to the next slide, Cindy. Perfect. Okay, so that's the the CEA roles. The civil service role we currently have posted as Associate Governmental Program Analyst, and it will also consider a Staff Services Analyst. So like Marianne mentioned, this is kind of an entry-level analytical position. For an complete application package, again, you're going to want to have that standard 678. You're going to want to have your resume and a statement of qualifications. This one looks a little different, so let's go through it again. We have the same section as before, the required application package documents, 678. I highly encourage you to use your Cal-Career account if you can. If not, you'll have to download that form. Resume is required and must be included, same as before. Any questions, please go ahead and pop them in the Q&A. One item I want to point out here is this other. The Associate Governmental Program Analyst or Staff Services Analyst, depending on which level you would like to apply for. has a minimum qualification pattern, which requires education. So if you're using your education to apply for the job to meet those minimum qualifications or minimum requirements as they're listed on the job posting, please go ahead and submit a unofficial copy of your transcripts with your application so that we can go ahead and verify that up front. If you're not using education, you're just going to use your experience, no problem. You could go ahead and bypass this requirement, no problem at all. The last item here is the statement of qualifications. And you'll see this one looks a little different than the one before for the CEA. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide and look at the statement of qualifications, which is located in the special requirements section of the job posting. So this one's a little different, whereas with the CEA, we're looking for a narrative description of your overall experience as it relates to the desirable qualifications. Here we have specific questions that we need our candidates to answer. So please, again, take careful note of the instructions, take careful note of the answer or the questions that you're being asked to answer. That should be what you submit for your statement of qualifications. As you can see in the note below, if you're not following the instructions, you may be disqualified. A very common error is folks will submit a cover letter or some other document in place of the SOQ. We cannot do that. We need to have this SOQ. So please make sure you're answering those questions. We can go ahead to the next slide. Perfect. So again, one more small difference between the Associate Governmental Program Analyst and then our CEA roles is that the AGPAs do have an assessment called an exam. It's really just an assessment of your training, education, and experience as it relates to the position. So on the job posting, when you're looking at that posting, just go ahead and scroll down to the bottom. There will be a section that says examination information. If you're applying as the AGPA, go ahead and take the AGPA exam. If you're applying as the SSA, go ahead and take that assessment. Again, it's just an online process. It's going to ask you various questions about your previous experience, education, and training. It's not an exam like we took in school, just an assessment. You do not have to take the assessment before you apply for the job. That's okay if you want to do it after. Just keep in mind, we will need your results before we can make any offers of employment. So it is important to get done when you can. Go ahead to the next slide. If you have any questions on navigating CalCareers, I find this very helpful for folks. So when you go to calcareers.ca.gov, that's where you can apply for these roles. At the very top right-hand corner of the page, there's a help tutorials link. When you click that, it'll take you to the page displayed here. There's frequently asked questions. There's tutorials with YouTube help, things like writing an SOQ. There's YouTube videos on that. Glossary, if there's any terms that you're unfamiliar with, there's a glossary for that. And then of course, there's our CalCareer Center with their email and phone number. If you have general questions about navigating CalCareers, please don't hesitate to reach out to them. They're happy to help you. If you have any questions about these specific roles, please go ahead and use the contact information on the job postings. That'll be for the HR contact and the hiring contact. And I think that was all I had. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you so much, Lila. Appreciate the information. So now it's time for our question and answer session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. We've already gotten a ton of questions, so I'm going to kind of field the questions with Lila and Marianne to help me answer them. So let's see. So the first question is, someone said, "This is exciting. Thank you for this thorough and clear explanation. Will the program analyst candidates require data experience or will there be training opportunities?" So I think that's a question for Marianne.
Yes, so this is a question, I think, about the AGPA position that we have open, that contract and procurement specialist. And the answer to that is there will be training opportunities. So if you look at the job description, there are some, you can look at the specific qualifications that are desired, especially around prior experience on contracts and things like that. But as to our data system and things like that, we're happy to provide training. So that's intended to be a more entry-level position and will help you grow as you join our team.
Thank you. And another question for you, Marianne, about the data director position. If you had to allocate percentages between the college transcript efforts and other research tasks, for example, the research library for your data director, what would that look like?
That's a great question. I think the initial work will focus mainly on the the tools that we need to build to make the data system usable, like the query builder and the dashboards. And then in our, penciled in future org chart, we imagine that this position will hire another position that will focus specifically on the scale up of the California colleges.edu and those kinds of operational tools. So this position will be responsible for working on that work and directing it and providing strategic guidance on it. But we imagine a lot of the work will focus primarily on that data journalism aspect of making insights from the data visible, and then working closely with our partners at CCGI and with a team of staff to work on that scale up. Great question.
So I'm seeing a trend here. The next question is about the same position, the Director of Data Programs. What are the technical skill sets you're looking for? You mentioned building a team and working with contractors. Will they be responsible for actually building the tools, or more so directing the vision and operations of getting those tools online?
So our ideal would be someone who has experience with both. So I think the most important part is directing the vision and imagining, here's what a dashboard needs to look like for it to be truly useful and to be able to engage in user-centered design and work with people to create something that's truly useful. Prior experience actually creating dashboards and data visualizations and being able to work with data would be very useful to be able to do that visioning part well. So I think our ideal candidate would be able to do both. But the way that this, I think we're really small. So one thing I want to be clear about across all of these positions, and it's true for me and it's true for Sydney and everyone else on the team, right now it's sort of all hands on deck for lots of different things, including, getting your hands dirty and creating, drafting the document yourself in many cases, or like going in there and creating the first thing. As we grow, then we'll be able to delegate a bit more of that work to contractors, and as we build the team, more to our teams as well. So lots of opportunities to kind of define the work and also develop a strategy for how we could most effectively do that work with a combination of contractors and team members.
Thank you. So the next question is, if an individual resides outside of the Sacramento area, but within California, and will travel to headquarters for meetings, etc., will they still be covered by the organization?
Okay, so I think this question is asking, so we have a team retreat, you live in Los Angeles, is it your job to pay for the flight up or for the train ride or drive? Lila, correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is, and what we've done so far, is that we can compensate for that travel if you're outside a certain radius from Sacramento.
Yeah, I think there's some additional information looking at travel, the reasoning, but typically, if the question is more about like the coming to Sacramento for the meetings and things like that, typical work requirements that I believe would be covered. If someone's outside, they would cover that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Lila, you're up. We'll give Marianne a little bit of a breather. The next question is, the position description indicated a strong benefits program with state civil service. Can you describe how the incumbent will be a CalPERS member, but won't start accruing service credit for 2 years? Does that change if you're already in CalPERS as a classic member?
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with a rule that it takes 2 years to start. If the person could potentially put that where they're seeing that in the chat, I'm happy to investigate that. My understanding is that, when you're hired on, you're accruing your CalPERS time immediately. And there are certain types of positions, like permanent intermittent positions, where it takes a little bit longer to become a PERS member, but these are all perm full-time positions. So I'm not familiar. It could be just where the information is being gathered. I'm happy to investigate further if they want to provide that source.
Thank you. And let's see, I guess this question can go back to Marianne. Someone said, thank you. Is the C2C office part of any existing department, for example, like the California Department of Education, or is it independent?
Thank you. I'm realizing we should have put that information on the slide, so I'm really glad we had a question about it. So we're an office within the Government Operations Agency, also called GovOps. So we're within GovOps as the umbrella agency, and then we are considered the Office of C2C Data. So we have our data providers. And if you look at the press release, you can see the list of all the 16 entities, but we're not underneath any of them. So we're kind of an independent entity within the state, and we're partnering with CDE. We're partnering with the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office, right? We're partnering with the Commission on Teacher Credentialing and all of our data providers who are in different parts of the state, but we're within GovOps. So that's our home agency.
Okay, next question, I think will probably be for Lila. On the online application, the standard 678, it asks for the basis of eligibility. Can you speak to how that relates to the statement of qualifications?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the online standard 678 that you complete is typically geared towards civil service positions. So if you are applying, for example, for the AGPA and you have taken and passed that assessment online exam, you're going to go ahead and put list eligibility because you are on an eligible list after you pass the exam. Your current state employee, you are transferring, so you'll go ahead and hit transfer, things like that. Again, I believe it was developed to be more geared towards civil service, not CEA. It's really not as impactful for a CEA. If you want to go ahead and select the other button and just fill in CEA and other, that works fine. If you'd like to go ahead and select list eligibility, that's okay. At the end of the day with CEAs, that SOQ serves as the exam or assessment. And so that's what we're building the basis of eligibility off of. So sorry about that. I've had folks select every single option of eligibility, that's okay. That won't impact your exam or score on the selection process.
Thank you. And next question again for Lila. This is a really good question. Are there templates or formatting guidelines for the statement of qualifications?
So there are instructions. When you go to the job posting, you scroll to that required application package documents section. I didn't read all of them for sake of time, but there is some instructions in there. It tells you a maximum page number. I do believe it says single spaced. I do believe it says 12-point font, but go ahead and read that very carefully. Other than that, really up to you how you want to structure that narrative. On the help topics that I showed up in one of my last slides, there is a YouTube video on writing statement of qualifications if you want to use that as a resource. But what I would suggest is reading that instruction in the required application document section very carefully and reading the desirable qualifications very carefully and being as detailed and specific as you can about how your education experience and training relates to the desirable qualifications.
Yes, and just to emphasize, please read those instructions super carefully. As a hiring manager myself and also as a state employee, that font size, the paragraph spacing, all of that is criteria for scoring your SOQ. So just be really cognizant of those instructions when you're applying. And another question about the statement of qualifications, I think you kind of touched on it, but are there sample SOQs to show how it would be different from the resume or standard 678? So I know, Lila, you just mentioned the how to do an SOQ YouTube video. I've watched that myself for prior positions. It's super helpful, but are there any other resources available that can show kind of examples or instructions on how to do one?
You know, that's tough, unfortunately, because CEAs, this SOQ is part of what's the exam or assessment process. It's confidential, so it's not something we would be able to share. But yeah, exactly like you said, the YouTube video, it's a narrative, right? It's a narrative discussion of how your education training experience applies to the desirable qualifications. So I would say, to Sydney's point, read the instructions, the formatting guidelines, and then structure it how you see fit to convey that information, how you meet those desirable qualifications.
And kind of a similar question, I think you just answered it. Should the SOQ also explicitly address the stated knowledge and abilities or just the desirable qualifications?
Likely there's going to be overlap. There's likely going to be, pieces of the desirables that meet the KSAs as well. Whatever you feel is necessary to adequately describe your education experience. Again, I would go back to those directions, specifically that bold section on the directions to refer to the desirables. But any information that is specific and can help support your response, I highly encourage getting that in there.
And the next question, does the CEA role need to take the CEA examination as well? So Lila, I think you touched on this kind of in your presentation, that the SOQ is basically the CEA examination. But I don't know if you want to add anything else to that explanation as well.
That's correct. So whereas with the AGPA, you're scrolling to that section on the job posting, clicking a link to go to an outside exam. With the CEA, it's that SOQ process.
Perfect. And so back to Marianne now. I think you've had enough of a breather. Now you're on the hot seat. So the first question, do both the AGPA and staff services role need to be Sacramento based? So again, I think you answered that in the sense that you do need to be a California resident, and that, obviously be able to come to Sacramento as necessary. But I know this role has a little bit of a different structure. So if you want to talk about what the admin unit requires as far as in person or not, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks for asking this. So right now, the two people we have on board on operations come into the office 2 days a week. Some of the work that we do still involves physical paper and work that's a little bit easier to do in an office occasionally. I'm planning to leave that question of whether there will in the future be operations positions that are 100% remote up to a position that we have not yet posted that would lead our operations work. So once we bring that person on board, want to have that person really think through what kind of in-person needs do we have for our operations team. So that's why I had that little asterisk. So right now our operations team is coming into the office on Tuesdays and Thursdays by default, with flexibility as needed, just to deal with some of like the physical paper and space needs work that we have. So that position will initially be hybrid. And then, as I mentioned, once we post for and hire a senior position to lead our operations work, that position will think through a long-term strategy for how our operations team, how remote-centric our operations team will be.
And next question for Marianne, what is the funding source for C2C and is there a sunset date?
Great question. So the funding source is the state of California. So the legislature made funding available for launching the office, both startup funding and ongoing funding that funds both our positions as well as the resources we need to procure and build the data system. I'm not aware that there's a sunset date. If you look at AB 132 from last summer, the legislation that established our office, there are a couple of important things we'll need to do by 5 years from now, including, and I was scrolling through some of the questions, so I'm just going to answer this at the same time. One of the questions was around California College Guidance Initiative and whether or not that will become a part of Cradle-to-Career. In the legislation, it said we need to figure that out within 5 years. So will that continue to be an independent entity we partner with? Is that going to be a part of our work, and will we subsume it? That's an open question. So if you look, there's like a 5-year plan for our work, and we have some important reports to do, but the vision is for this data system to be established as an ongoing resource for California.
Great, and next question, can you talk about if the positions under the Director of Data Programs, if they will have any IT classifications reporting to them in the future?
That's a good question. I'm hoping to have, once we bring these directors on board, to have them be a part of the decision-making process of exactly how to structure the teams that they build. Big picture, we want to remain a very small, lean team. So that's why I want to bring the directors on first and then have a collaborative decision-making process on how to make the best use of the positions we have. Right now, our default plan was to have most of the IT positions report to the Director of Data Infrastructure and had more like research program manager type positions and vision for Director of Data Programs, but that's not set in stone. The concrete isn't set yet, so we can figure out what works best together.
Thank you. Next question, still for Marianne. How much travel is anticipated for the Director of Engagement to garner engagement with communities and stakeholders across the state?
That's a really great question. I think it'll be really important for our work to really reflect the perspectives of California, not Sacramento. Now, some of that I think is effectively done by, getting on the train or however you get around, going to different parts of the state. That being said, I think the pandemic has shown us just how much more accessible and easy it is to reach people via Zoom as a complement to that. So I think the answer is both. And I'm hoping that the person who takes on this role can map out a really important strategy for figuring out, how can I best reach all of the communities that we need to engage in this. So the students, the parents, the teachers, the educators in the Central Valley, in Los Angeles, in Northern California, in the Bay Area, in rural areas. And some of that, you might decide that you can do that most effectively via Zoom. And some of that you might decide it's better to actually go and listen into existing sessions or meetings that are happening and to learn. So I think it's it depends. And I think this position will have a lot of discretion in figuring out a plan for how to do that. So do I think the job can be done effectively only staying in Sacramento? Probably not. But I think that this position can really think through, like, how am I going to use Zoom and existing meetings and travel all together to ensure that, I'm really learning from all the communities.
And so we have a couple of questions about the timeline. So I'm just going to combine them into one big question. For Marianne. So what is your ideal timeline for onboarding these positions and going through the hiring process? I know Lila's smiling because I'm with you, state hiring. I will be completely honest, as an employee of the state, it is a very long process. So Marianne, if you have any insight on what your ideal time frame is, in state speak, of course, because we know that nobody's going to be getting a call by June 1st, right? But if you can talk about, what your ideal timeline is for hiring, potentially interviewing and onboarding this person, that'd be great.
So that's great. So there's the ideal timeline, and then there's what's likely to occur. So these positions close May 31st. After that, we will, go through CalHR's process of reviewing the applications and having a hiring panel that conducts one or more rounds of interviews and then connects with candidates and takes a decision. So our ideal process would be to begin that review as soon as we can after the position closes and to proceed with that. But I would actually like to punt it over to Lila a bit, because there are some caveats in terms of these CEA positions being posted through the state processes and everything else. So maybe Lila, you can shed light on kind of realistic timelines. My preference is to both make the hiring decisions and have people start as soon as possible. Our key priority is to find the right fit and the most qualified person for the role within the constraints and supports of the state hiring process. So Lila, do you want to add any specifics to that?
Sure. Yeah, I agree. We do have, we're establishing this as a new agency. So we're actually establishing our CEA positions while we're recruiting for them. So that takes a little bit of time. Ideally, I think we allow a little bit of time after the final filing dates for mailed in applications that were postmarked by the final filing date to come in. We do an initial review of the application packages, make sure they're complete. So folks read all the instructions we went over about the complete application packages, things like that. And then to Marianne's point, we assemble panels and move through the process. We will reach out to you the week that the final filing date occurs. We will give you an estimate of when you will hear from us next. Typically, I would say, an exam process, as long as there's no, I'm hesitant now because going through COVID, it's like you used to always say, oh, this is how much time it takes to do things. And then you never know what can happen. But typically the exam process is maybe 2 to 3 weeks. I would only say 3 weeks if a panel member maybe had a vacation or anything coming up that maybe slows the process down, and then the interview process can occur right after that. So we're looking at maybe 2 months. But like I said, we will send communication. We'll notify you when we're moving through the process. Please, as you apply, take note of the contact information, the HR contact information, and you're more than welcome to reach out at any time for a status. We'll be happy to provide that information.
Thank you. So a few more questions. I know we have about 9 minutes left. So I will try to prioritize them as much as I can. But we did get an interesting question. Are there any restrictions on contractors applying for the jobs? And I don't know, Lila, if you want to take that one.
No, anybody who CEAs are open to, well, both positions. CEAs are open to anybody who, applies and submits that paperwork as required on the job posting. The AGPA would be open to anybody who meets the minimum requirements as posted on the job posting. So no concerns there.
Perfect. And then I'm assuming this question is regarding the open AGPA position. This person asked, do you need to take both the AGPA and SSA exams to be able to apply?
That's an excellent question. What I would suggest is when you're on the job posting, you'll see the job description. It gives you information about the job itself, C2C, and then right below that, there's a section that says minimum requirements. And you can click, there's a link for the AGPA, there's a link for the SSA. You can click that and that'll take you to what's called the specification page, which will tell you what the minimum qualifications or minimum requirements are. So if you meet the minimum qualifications for the AGPA, I suggest applying for that level. If you don't quite, that's the more associate level, the journey level, it's a little bit higher. If you don't quite meet those MQs yet, minimum qualifications yet, I would suggest looking at the staff services analyst, see if that's those are minimum qualifications that you're able to meet. But there's no need to apply for both levels. There's no need to take the exam for both levels. If you meet one or the other, you certainly can, if you'd like to say you'd like to be considered for both. And I encourage you to take any and all online assessments for classifications that you're eligible for. But you won't be able to submit 2 application packages per se. So I would just take a look and see what classification most aligns with your experience, your qualifications, and then apply for that one and take that exam.
Thank you. Let's see, the next question is back to Mary Ann. For the Director of Engagement position, do you envision policy development as a direct result of community engagement and multidisciplinary teams' input?
So I think policy development means something different to different people. So let me describe what I think the question is getting at. I think the main role of the Director of Communication is to try to share the work that we're doing really transparently and to listen and understand the concerns from communities and ensure that there's this two-way communication channel that we're having with lots of different entities who are working with our work. I'm actually going to drop something in the chat here. During the planning process, they developed some personas of potential users of the data system. If you're having a hard time imagining, like, what is this data system and what will it look like in practice and for whom, scrolling through some of these might be helpful. Now, so the second part of the question on like policy change, I think one way to think about that is the work that Sydney leads around the governing board and the advisory boards. So I report to the 21-person governing board. The 2 advisory boards are going to give recommendations to the governing board via our office. So those questions around kind of policy decisions around the system, that governance structure is a really important component of that. Every member of our team will be at some point touching aspects of that work, but the work that Sydney's leading in working with the governing board and working with the advisory boards is going to be the formal channel for a lot of those recommendations, including things like, how should the data system change in the future? Should we bring in different data points? Should we be envisioning it in a different way than it is today? That's the governance structure that's been established for surfacing those recommendations and then taking decisions at the governing board level and like high level guidance. And then our office is charged with kind of implementing the strategy that the governing board has signed off on.
Thank you. So I think we might have time for 1 or 2 last questions. So I see kind of questions that I can kind of combine. So can you share, Mary Ann, just any more information about future roles that we'll be hiring for? And is there a planned org chart that we're planning to post publicly on our website that shows current positions, vacant positions, and then any future positions? So if you can just kind of talk about broadly, what's our future look like as far as building our team?
Yes, I'm happy to describe that. We're in the process of updating our org chart and having that officially approved through the various channels. So that's why it's not on the website right now. But imagine the org chart essentially, as I mentioned, I report to the governing board. So we have the governing board at the top, then we have the executive director, and then we imagine 4 main teams. So 1 on data infrastructure. So the director would hire a team on that. 1 on data programs for the data visualizations and working on the scale up of the tools, 1 on engagement and communications, and then 1 on operations. So those are kind of the bigger teams. And then there are important additional functions that are part of the org chart but don't fit into those buckets. So one is Sydney's role, which is all about, strategic partnerships and engagement, but specific to the board and advisory boards as currently defined. So think of that as like board engagement. And then we also have our legal counsel, we have our EEO officer, chief security information officer. So there's a few additional roles like that don't fall under one of the buckets, but think of the team sort of initially starting out as those 4 larger teams, and then a few unique additional leadership roles that complement that.
Thank you. And so kind of last question, again, I'll just ask this question broadly than what's in the Q&A, but how much experience in education and education policy are you looking for the CEA position specifically?
That's a great question. For all 3 of the positions, I think our hope, and this is why it's a desired qualification, but not a required one, right? Our hope is to bring people on board who have a deep understanding of K-12 and higher education, or some combination of the 2. And this will look different for the different positions. So the director of data infrastructure, it's important to understand the underlying data that we will be getting from our data partners, right? For director of data programs, it's really important to understand the needs of teachers and students and education researchers in California. And then for the director of communications, I think it's really important to understand both the policy and political landscape in education in California at the K-12 and higher education level, perhaps through experience at the legislature, perhaps experience at the executive branch, perhaps experience working from the outside, but closely with state government. So for all 3 of these, I think the positions our hope is to bring on people who have a depth of understanding in that. And also, as I mentioned before, when I was talking about the AGP position, we're also all learning. We're all learning on the job. So even if you feel like you don't have all of those pieces of experience, still apply. And as anyone knows who's hired, it's always a process of going through applications, and different people bring different strengths to their applications. So that was a long-winded way of saying it's a hoped for and desired quality that I think will be really useful for our work, but encourage you to apply even if you have some doubts about whether your experience qualifies as, sufficiently extensive. So please apply, including because we'll have future roles, and there may be other opportunities down the road as well.
Whew, thank you. We have 1 minute left. 1 minute left. I think we did a really good job with timing. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Lila and Marianne. And thank you everyone who joined us today. I hope that you all apply for these jobs. Join us at the state. And regarding Marianne's last point, please do not sell your experience short. Just apply, throw yourself out there. My motto is let them tell you no, don't tell yourself no. So apply, see what happens. And we hope to connect with everyone soon. I know we did not get to some questions. Marianne put some really good information in the chat regarding our work specifically. I really wanted to prioritize the questions about the specific job postings to make sure you all get the information you need. But if you have any questions about our system or our work, please reach out at info@c2c.ca.gov. And yes, I will be posting everything online on our careers page for you to be able to access this webinar and our slides again. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Great job, Sydney.
Thanks.